think it's time to feed. Surprise!
Eaten in the streets, businesses destroyed, and portrayed in popular culture as subhumans that brought violence and disease, the corralling of Jews in the ghettos was popularly supported by Germans. The Nazis' initial plan called for the mass deportation and resettlement of Jews to areas outside of Germany. However, as the war progressed, the Nazis built concentration and extermination camps throughout Germany and Europe. In the end, the death toll was staggering. 6 million Jews and more than 600,000 European Roma, those that they called gypsies, were brutalized, starved, and shot. After World War II in 1945, it was decided by the imperialist nations of Britain and the United States to utilize the United Nations to create a Jewish homeland. There were several areas where this homeland could have been, but in the end, it was a toss-up between Uganda and Palestine. Palestine lost. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution recommending the adoption and implementation of a plan to partition Palestine. This act led to the creation of the settler colonial state of Israel. The Israeli state developed a system of colonialism, Zionism, which ensured that the indigenous Arab population would be subjugated, contained to specific areas, stripped of their resources, and made powerless to push back against the ever-expanding borders of that imperialist-sponsored partition of their land. The Palestinian Liberation Organization began in 1964 with the purpose of creating an independent state of Palestine. It is recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people by over 100 states with which it holds diplomatic relations. Israel has labeled the Palestinians prior to and during their ongoing struggle for liberation as subhuman terrorists. In the eyes of the Israeli, the sole crime of the Palestinians is that they exist. It is ironic that Israel, a nation of the persecuted, has developed a system of brutality and dehumanization that created one of the modern world's largest refugee populations, the Palestinians. The irony of any country exposes its true nature. It rings true of America as well. With bloody, wet hands from the enslavement of Africans and the destruction of Africa, along with the deliberate genocide of the indigenous populations of the Americas, it's ironic that the United States believes that it is a beacon of freedom to the rest of the world. As one thinks about the history of America, it is clear that the oft-repeated phrases of democracy, freedom, truth, and justice are in practice a type of political schizophrenia used to camouflage the imperialist domination of other countries, the seizure of their resources, and internationally and domestically, the rigging of political elections and political assassinations. The irony of Israel is that those that survived a German-planned systemic annihilation process arrived at a foreign land, which they then stole and created an apartheid-type state, Jew versus Arab, then maintained a long, bloody history of destroying and dehumanizing the Palestinians. As Africa has become more decimated and destabilized by the imperialist and neo-colonialist governments, we are witnessing another forced relocation, one that Chairman O'Malley characterizes as Africans following the trail of their resources. In the case of Israel, African populations from the Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea have arrived in larger numbers. In this hostile land, they are forced to fight for scraps and exist on the edge as unofficial persons. In the Israeli media, Africans are labeled as filthy, diseased, and violent people whose presence is indicative of the destruction of the very fiber of Israeli society. It's important to note that increasingly there are raids to capture and imprison undocumented Africans. Israel has the largest imprisoned African refugee population in the world and is currently building a massive prison with a capacity to hold 11,000 people in the desert. As a point of reference, the largest prison in the U.S., the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, holds 5,000. At this moment in Israel, Africans are popularly described as subhumans and subjected to terror on the streets by Israeli settlers and face concentration camp prisons, all of which is reminiscent of the persecution that Jews faced from the Nazis. History has shown us the Israelis would later inflict the same treatment onto the Palestinians. And now, to the Africans. Isn't it ironic? Joining us via Skype from Stockholm, Sweden, is Jonathan, an Eritrean refugee that escaped from Israel just a few days ago. Jonathan, welcome to Africa Live, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Jonathan, please tell us what's going on currently in the state of Israel as it relates to the African populations.
What's going on is nothing short of inhumane treatment by the Israeli state. African refugees are not seen as refugees, but as some sort of infiltrators that came to do harm to the state of Israel, which is completely false, doesn't have any ground. It's not even logical, but logic doesn't seem to work in Israel anymore. It's just hate. Actually, I could describe it by hate or malice or ignorance. I don't know. But what's happening right now, it's crazy. A few years back in 2012, June 2012, actually, they passed this legislation that arrested any refugee that came to Israel. They call it illegal. I mean, do you know any refugee that comes legally? You usually just cross a border to seek any sort of refuge in a country, and yet these people call it illegal infiltration to the country, and they passed the anti-infiltration law, which actually arrested and apprehended all these refugees for 3 years without any form of legal advocacy. And after all this, you don't even know if you get released. And many NGOs and human rights advocates fought this. And this year, actually, this year that's about to be ended, they kind of canceled that legislation. But then they came up with something pretty much the same. You can't call it different. They came up with the idea of an open detention center right in the middle of the desert. They would gather all those refugees and they would put them there in some miserable conditions and take roll calls 3 times a day and expect these refugees to live in that desert, completely excluded from civilization. It's as if it's some huge human zoo. Well, you can't expect refugees to stay there, so they protested. Supposedly, the Israeli state is a democracy, and yet, when these people protested, they were met with harsh, actually, reactions. They were beaten up, arrested. Some of them we don't even know what happened to them, but for certain, most of them were arrested, and those who could even run were they caught up with them. And that's pretty much what we know so far. And of course, they are actually gathering refugees from the streets of Tel Aviv. If someone for any reason forgets his visa and steps out of his home, and a cop asks for that visa, and he said it's right in the room, I'm going to get it, they don't care. They just need a reason to take you and haul you off. And it's pretty much crazy. People are scared to go to work, not knowing if they're going to go home or to these detention centers. And it's looking very, very dire. And what's more confusing and surprising is the silence of the world against all this inhumane treatments of African refugees in Israel.
Jonathan, please share with us why you believe so many Eritreans leave their homeland and make the long and dangerous trip to Israel.
For one, we don't have a functioning state anymore. We have a crazy monster for president, and all these people, maybe for different reasons, but most, and they share this lack of democracy, lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of movement, lack of freedom of pretty much lack of freedom of everything. So they run away from this, and because the Eritrean regime has strong influence even in Sudan, they have to get as far away from Eritrea as possible. And the thing is, the Israelis react as if all Eritreans go to Israel. At this point, I don't think you will find a nation where there is no Eritrean refugee. I mean, the whole globe. I mean, there all the way up to China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the States, Latin America, Europe, everywhere, all over Africa. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they have internationally been recognized as refugees, and our situation has been sympathized, empathized with, and yet the Israeli states is deliberately being blind and deaf to our situation and just, you know, just focusing on the fact that they think we are infiltrators.
Throughout the world, Israel is considered to be a highly spiritual place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. But it sounds like it didn't live up to your expectations.
Well, it's really sad to see this happening. I mean, I never expected this. If someone had asked me like 2 years ago when I was in Eritrea to if they could have made me choose or asked me which country that I think would be best suitable for a refugee, I would have just like without thinking would have gone to say Israel. But it's completely the opposite. If you are a refugee, Israel is no place to go.
Jonathan, when you left Eritrea, was your plan to go to Israel or somewhere else?
Actually, I did not take any route toward Israel. I wasn't supposed to go to Israel. My plan was to stay in Africa. I had no intention to go to Israel or Europe or the States, but due to the ongoing human trafficking network that extends from Sudan all the way to Egypt, I was kidnapped from Sudan and ended up in Sinai and then to Israel.
Jonathan, for security reasons, let's not talk in detail about the specific routes of travel, but share with us your thoughts and what you discovered about what it meant to be an African in Israel during your initial days there.
In the first few months, I don't think I had much interaction with many people. I was really kind of excluded. That was actually my own choice, but I met with some Eritreans that came and told me about what's happening in, what happens in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Beersheba, because I was curious to know what Israel is really like. And the things they were telling me it was really, really horrific. I did not expect it. At first, I couldn't believe them. I said maybe you had well, a different concept, or maybe I don't know, maybe you took one topic and just um, focused on it. I don't know. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't grasp the fact that the Israeli state would do this to refugees, and especially African refugees. And well, when I went out to the streets and tried to find work and to just earn a living, because you don't get support from the Israeli state, the one thing they do is even before they passed the legislation of the anti-infiltration law, even before when they were actually quite, when I say good, I mean like in between double quotes, um, they would just simply detain you for a while and then just pile you in a bus and simply dump you in a park in South Tel Aviv. And after that, with no integrational system, nobody teaching you the language, nobody supplying you with food or anything that would help you survive, and you would be given um, a paper. This clearly states that you are not supposed to work. I mean, what's a person supposed to do? You're not given any support food wise, shelter wise, and at the same time, if you want to earn your live for your living, you you are completely blocked from working. What are you supposed to do? What's a human being supposed to do in that case? Because that's what the Israeli state did. And then they issued the anti-infiltration law, which pretty much blocked all the refugees. They confined them to all these prisons. And it was getting worse and worse, and even those who protested within those prisons were treated harshly. There were a few friends of mine that tried to protest in the form of hunger strike, but they were separated from the group and taken somewhere I can only describe as Horrible, horrible, horrible. And after all this, they have taken this new legislation to gather all these refugees. It would have been a lot easier to just invest a million or two to make all the lives of these refugees better with more integrational abilities and help. And yet they choose to spend about 10 or more million dollars to build all these detention centers. Just they would spend more money to do negative actions than positive ones.
Jonathan, I want to emphasize to the listeners that the prisons that you speak of, that these are the prisons where Africans are incarcerated in Israel, and that these are the largest prisons in the country. Moreover, it's becoming increasingly clear every day that the Zionists in Israel are committed to having deep austerity cuts, deep policies of austerity to ensure that they can build higher and higher capacity prisons just for the African refugee communities.
Yes, actually, yes, they did. And the crazy thing is, there was some uproar about this because they took a huge slice from the economy to build these prisons, and yet they would choose to do that. I don't know. For some reason, they seem to be, intent on doing the wrong thing, even though it costs them a lot. It would have been a lot easier to help these refugees actually to use this, actually 10% of this money that could make a huge difference with these refugees' lives, and yet they don't. And what's worse is that if a refugee is blessed to have a kid in Israel, they don't even get a birth certificate. That's the horrible part. The way refugees are treated, it's not just about work, it's not just about you, it's even affects your children. I mean, what did the children do? I mean, you can assume that someone, okay, let's say even worst case scenario, they can assume someone is coming there intent on hurting them, but what did a baby do? What did a child do um, to refuse the parent a birth certificate, as simple as a birth certificate, which everybody takes for a given in the Western world. And yet, for the African refugee in Israel, a birth certificate for a child, for your own child, is like a miracle.
Jonathan, please share with us the daily existence of a refugee.
Well, it's harsh. It's really, really, really harsh because one, you have to you have to be careful not to be caught by the Eritrean regime, because if you get caught, it means underground prisons, imprisonment, which usually means you don't get to see the daylight ever again. Um, Once you get out of there, it's very hard to cross even away from Sudan, because the kidnapping is still going strong near Kassala, the border between Sudan and Eritrea. And after that, it still doesn't get easy because it's places that you have never been before, languages that you don't speak, cultures that you're a stranger to. So life of a refugee is really, really hard from the first day that he or she decides to leave their homeland. Regardless of the reason, people are just desperate to keep a great distance between themselves and Eritrea right now. Because, like I said, the regime has strong influence in some African nations and even some European nations too, but they're just trying to get as far away as possible. Some take land routes through deserts, some take very, very dangerous crossings of seas. And I wouldn't be surprised to hear something really new and horrible route that refugees take to escape from this horrible regime.
Jonathan, what was your status when you left Israel? Were you officially recognized as a refugee?
Let alone refugee status, I wasn't allowed to apply for asylum seeking. Um, I had no status at all in Israel. I didn't even have the temporary protection that everybody had. Um, my plan right now is to seek asylum here, which is actually compared to, you can actually say heaven, comparatively speaking, to Israel.
Jonathan, in the news footage, we see the aggressive Zionist groups surrounding Africans, demanding that they leave Israel. What are your thoughts on those participants, and have you had any interaction with them on the streets of Tel Aviv?
They might have been misled by the media because they always try to get excuses so that they would try to alienate you. They don't want you to integrate into the society. They put in focus. If, for example, there is one incidence of rape and then that is it, you would think that 100 or 1,000 people were raped. And when there were some statistical comparisons, someone pointed out that more rapes were done in other areas where completely Israeli citizens lived than those in refugees area. They completely ignored those reports, and they just try to use the media to influence the population to be against these refugees. And when I even confronted some of these actually supposed protesters, they don't realize that we are refugees. They don't know anything. And when you point this out, they just go, "Ah, I didn't know this. Ah, I didn't even know this." And some would not be willing to listen, but those that do, you don't see them protesting anymore because then they understand, then they wake up from the government's propaganda.
Jonathan, what would you say is the future for the African refugee communities in Israel?
Well, that's the thing. It's the decisions that are made are always so impulsive. It's hard to predict anything in Israel. For one, nowadays, people have been deported to Eritrea on the pretense that they have volunteered to go to Eritrea. But then again, if you detain someone without end, and then just give them one option and one option only, and that is to voluntarily go to Eritrea. Some people did it, but it could never be called voluntary deportation when the only other alternative is infinite detention. And some people have been tricked, persuaded, yeah, persuaded a bit harshly actually in some points to take this decision. And now with these detention centers and everything, with all these protests, I don't know. They might make this a huge issue, blow it out of proportion, and say, like, they start to protest now, they will be worse in a few months, days, or years, and might even pass some more harsher legislation, or on one pretense or another, might deport them to Eritrea. But one thing is for certain. Every day they think of something that would make the life of a refugee in Israel as miserable as possible. And according to one of their ministers just a year ago, he said, "We will not deport them officially, but we will make their lives so miserable that they will willingly go back to the desert." That's what he said, word for word. From what I've heard, learned, examined in these few months in Israel, I came to the conclusion that our only crime as African refugees is that we are black and non-Jewish.
You're listening to Africa Live on the Uhuru Radio Network. In this segment entitled, Isn't It Ironic?, we spoke with Jonathan, an Eritrean refugee that had recently left the settler colonial state of Israel. We discussed how the newspapers, the politicians, and the people of Israel have labeled African refugees as subhuman and framing their presence in Israel as a pest that is destroying the country. We highlight as well that this was done to the Palestinians by the Israelis, and that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had done the same actions to the Jews to ensure the full support and participation of the German people in the intentional genocidal policies directed at the Jews and the Roma people. Jonathan, thank you for joining us and sharing your experience.
You're welcome.
You're listening to WhoRadio.com, voice of the International African Revolution.